they haven't gotten the funds yet, but I was told, they asked me what I want to do. And I said, we need to rescind it. So we went to the Illinois Director of Housing, or whatever it was, that oversees all this, and they said, no, we can't rescind it. So they ended up getting to rescind it. Yeah, it was a nightmare. Good evening again. I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole for the Village of Cary for October 17th, 2023 to order with roll call.
Weinhammer? Here. Stefani?
Here.
Collier?
Here.
Walrath?
Here.
McAlpine? Here.
Thank you. Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance again. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Now moving to the public comment portion. The public is invited to make an issue-oriented comment on any matter of public concern not otherwise on the agenda. I have nobody signed in. Is there anybody who would like to address the Committee of the Whole? We'll go ahead and close the public comment at 6:13. A couple things on our agenda: the Police Pension Fund actuarial projection discussion, and we're going to introduce our Finance Manager, Brian Leahy. You want to pick us up?
So we have Heidi from Foster & Foster here to present the police pension valuation report and address any questions.
Thank you. Yeah. I believe you all have a copy of this in your meeting packet. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to start with page 5 of that report. So on page 5, it says summary of report at the top. It's sort of our bottom line on top page here. Just to acclimate you to what you're going to be seeing tonight, the numbers on the leftmost side are going to be this year's numbers. The numbers in the rightmost column are going to be reflective of what we came to you with last year, so that you could see the year-over-year impact of any changes that happened in the fund.
Could I just pause you for 1 second?
Absolutely.
When you were looking at the page numbers, I just assumed it's Foster & Foster's page 5, not our page 7.
It is Foster & Foster's page 5. Okay, so if we look at that page that says summary of the report at the top, you can see that the contribution did increase year over year by about 7%. That happened for a couple of reasons. First of all, the methodology that we do employ to calculate the annual contribution. If all of my actual assumptions come true annually, I will be coming to you with an annual increase. That is the nature of how we amortize the unfunded actual accrued liability. So every year it does increase by the nature of the methods that are employed there. In addition, we did see unfavorable plan experience year over year. This happened in most funds that I'm talking to this year. Hopefully we see that reverse next year, but it's largely driven by the market. We do smooth assets, so we're not eating all of that market volatility all at once, but we're reflecting 20% of those losses per year, and that was enough to bring the return down this year, where we're not meeting our 7% expected return on the fund. So that'll happen in some years. Hopefully next year I get to come back with a better, rosier message, but this year that did contribute to a loss. In addition, we did see a loss due to the fact that there was no mortality that happened in the fund. So to the extent that deaths do happen, those do tend to cause gains to the fund. The most morbid thing I have to talk about as an actuary, but it's the reality of it. Because there were no deaths in the fund, that does mean that there's more ongoing liability now as a result of that. Okay. If we turn to page 7 of the report, 7 of the Foster & Foster report, the top says competitive summary of principal valuation results. There's 3 sections here. Section A is the information we receive from you to perform the valuation. Section B shows you those assets, and then Section C gets into the liabilities. In terms of the data that we received, there was very little activity in your fund year over year. So you really moved from 24 to 25 actives. That was just by simply hiring one more person. There were no retirements. There were no terminations. No real activity happened in your fund this year. There was 2 terminated vesteds that took a refund of their contributions. They weren't carrying much liability anyway. Basically, they can leave their contributions sit in your fund. They earn no interest on that money. You actually earn interest on that money, so it doesn't really harm the fund when they don't take that. But the only thing that they are ever owed from the fund is their own money from their own employee contributions. Okay? Section B is the next section. This is the assets I mentioned. The concept of the smooth value of assets. So we have an actual value and a market value. We basically smooth 20% of the gains and losses of the fund every year. To the extent that the fund achieves over 7%, that's a gain. To the extent that the fund falls short of the 7% assumption, that's a loss. And then we spread those over a 5-year time frame. If we look at the relationship of the actual value to the market value, you can see it's about 6.5% higher than market value. That's telling me we have deferred losses that have not yet been reflected. So we do expect the next couple of years to continue to roll those in. Hopefully we have some gains in the future to help offset some of that. But that is exactly what the smoothing method should be doing. A couple of years ago, I was coming to you, and the relationship was the opposite. The actual value actually lagged market value. So that's exactly what it's supposed to be doing. It's mitigating that volatility in the contribution that I bring to you. Okay. Section C is the first liability calculation that we do. Basically, the bottom of that column, there's a number of $34.9 million. If you had assets of that value in the fund today, you would be fully funded on the 48 participants in the fund, and you wouldn't have to pay any more, assuming all my assumptions came true. Now, that would not be a number you'd want to fund to, because this number has baked into it future earnings of those actives, future service accruals of those actives that haven't happened yet. So on page 8, we actually split those up. So the next page. Near the bottom of that leftmost column is a number of $29.9 million. That number is reflective of service that your actives have earned to date. This is what you're funding towards. So ideally, if you were fully funded, you would have $29.9 million in the fund. To the extent that you're short of that amount, that's the number below that, the unfunded actual accrued liability of $12.5 million. That's basically service that's been earned and not yet paid for. So the village has a mortgage basically outstanding on that needs to be paid off over time to basically catch up to accruals that have already happened in the fund. That gives you a funded status of 58.3. So despite the market conditions, you did see improvement in your funded status, so we're continuing to move in the right direction. And that's generally been a message I've been able to deliver every year too. The last number I want to point out on this page is the total normal cost. It's near the middle of that column. It's $541,000. That's basically the cost of your active officers earning 1 year of pension benefits. So that will be part of the contribution, which we will look at on page 10 of the Foster & Foster report. Section E here on page 10 shows you all of the contribution components. So these numbers here do have interest applied. So I did talk about normal cost a page ago. The normal cost on this page does have a year of interest applied because we know it's not paid on May 1st. It's paid later in the year. So in a perfect world, your contribution would be your normal cost, so the cost of those accruals, plus your administrative expense of just the cost to maintain the fund. And then we'd offset from that the expected member contributions, because remember, the officers pay 9.91% of their salary towards the accrual of this benefit. So if you were fully funded, that would be your contribution on an annual basis. But as I mentioned, you have that mortgage outstanding on that unfunded actual accrued liability that you're working to pay down. That's the number in the middle of that section, the $969,000. That's 72% of the recommended contribution of $1.3 million is just due to that mortgage payment, basically. So I guess the good news is in 18 years, that goes away, but it'll take a while. You know, you need to continue to pay that down. If we look at section F, this is a section I like to look at for the health of the fund. So if I compare the village requirement for this time frame, which was the $1.215 million, to what actually was contributed, the village actually contributed 97% of what we recommended. So I could see that basically the village is attempting to keep pace with what our recommendations are here. That's generally been true here, and that's a good thing to see. So I'm sure the fund thanks you for that. If we turn to page 11, on page 11 of our report, section H at the top just shows you the schedule of the unfunded actual accrued liability. So if all my assumptions come true, this is the timing of how things will be paid down and how that unfunded will change over time. By 2041, we're fully funded based on the methodology that's being employed today. If we turn to page 12, so this is where I want to talk a little bit about the assumption that is being used to pay down that unfunded liability. So we do use a 7% assumption in the fund. In addition, we use what's called a payroll growth assumption. Basically, what it is trying to do is tie the amortization payment here to be a level percentage of what we predict department payroll will be. So right now, we're inherently assuming that the department payroll is going to grow by 3.5% per year, so that we have the same percentage payment on the unfunded of that department payroll each year. So next year, my 906 goes up by 3.5%, okay? If you were to drop that payroll growth down to, say, 0% and amortize this like a mortgage on a home where your annual payment is the same each year and you don't see the growth on that payment, that number goes from 906 to 1,159,000. So about a $253,000 increase. It's a very hard assumption to move, and I'm not recommending you move to 0%. We would like to see you come down off the 3.5. You are on the high end. I'd say I have no funds that are over 3.5. 3.5 is definitely the highest, and at this point, it's starting to become an outlier just because funds are bringing that down a bit. So to the extent that when that's affordable, to bring that down is sort of prudent in the sense that it levels the future contribution, so you won't see the steep increase. It does increase the short-term contribution, but at the advantage of not having the long-term burden that you would otherwise have. So this is effectively, the higher the payroll growth assumption, the more you're sort of kicking the can in a sense. I wouldn't say you're quote kicking the can here, but it is pushing more payments into the future by using a higher assumption here. So when it's affordable, that's always prudent to bring down. Okay, so if we look at page 14, this shows you the reconciliation of the changes in the contribution. So item 1 is last year's contribution. Item 3 is what we're recommending this year, and you could see the various things that contributed to that increase. The heavy hitters here are really that amortization payment, that payroll growth assumption. So 3.5% over last year on that amortization payment increased by about $31,000. Every year I'll be coming to you with a number about $31,000 higher if all my assumptions come true. So that's what we're talking about, that payroll growth assumption. The investment return also contributed about $20,000 to this increase. That the fact that the actual return was 5.4% versus the 7% assumption is what caused that. And then you did add a head count. So, you know, your normal costs did go up a little bit because you added participants to the population. Okay. If we look at page 18 now, 18 through 20 show you the assumptions that we've employed to perform the valuation. If you recall, last year we made a number of changes here. That was primarily due to the fact that there was a study performed for all of the Article 3 funds across the state of Illinois to basically reassess the appropriateness of the retirement rates, disabled rates, termination rates, all of those. And we did apply those here. Most funds in Illinois are too small to have their own tables built. There's just not enough retirement experience, not enough termination experience. So we do leverage the fact that we can pool all of those Article 3 funds and come up with tables that are appropriate for those across the whole state. So that is what's being applied here. You are using a 7% interest rate. I wouldn't say it's on the high end, but it's a little bit higher than what we see a lot of funds at. You know, I'm not suggesting you should bring that down, but it is important to note, like, for example, IPOPIF is at 6.8%. I'd say most funds are in that ballpark, more like 6, 7, 5. So you're a little bit higher, not overly aggressive, but, you know, I wouldn't call the 7% conservative. So that's important to understand. Page 19, a couple things to note here. That payroll growth I did mention being high. The other thing to keep in mind is we are still amortizing based on Illinois statute. This is your report. You do not have to follow Illinois statute here. You get a whole separate report that follows Illinois statute from IPOPIF, the Illinois Police Officers Pension Investment Fund, that consolidated fund where all of the Article 3 funds are being invested now. That you get a report from them that follows the Illinois statute funding to 90% funding target using project unit credit. Here we're using an entry age normal cost method. It's a little bit better cost method for, especially for smaller funds because it has a more steady pattern of payments. And we are funding to the full liability, 100%, which is what any actuary would tell you is the prudent way to fund. So in light of that, right now you're still tying to that 2040 end date funding. That's fine now. You have 18 years until you get to that point that you're near that end date. But as you start approaching that, you'll start introducing a lot of volatility to your amortization payment to the extent there's any market gains and losses, anything that happens with liability. If you have a significant flood of retirements, that could influence how the contribution spikes as you start approaching that end date. The other thing that's going to happen, you know, it's been brought up in Springfield many times, but we think it's becoming more and more eminent, is that 2040 date's going to change. We think it's going to probably change to 2050. We do not recommend chasing that. We think that you should put into place a funding policy that makes sense for the village of Cary, not chasing statute. Like I said, you'll get the report from them, and that's the minimum you have to contribute. This is for you to really, be fiscally responsible with how this fund is being managed, and you've done a good job of that so far. Okay, I'm going to turn you all the way now to page 30. On page 30, this is the data that we collected from you to perform the valuation. We do snapshot valuations, meaning that whatever people are in the fund on the valuation date of May 1st, whatever their status is on that date is what is represented here. So to the extent somebody retires on May 2nd, we'll pick that up in the next valuation. If we look at your actives here, we do have them broken down by Tier 1 versus Tier 2. About 52% of your population is Tier 2 at this point. That's important to note because right now Tier 2 benefits lag Tier 1 benefits. They're not as valuable. And so to the extent that you see more Tier 1s retire out and being replaced with more Tier 2s, that normal cost will continue to come down as well. Now, there is legislation in Springfield right now suggesting they might want to basically move those Tier 2s back up to Tier 1. We'll see if that has legs at some point, but it is worth noting that there is a possibility that legislation is passed that will cost the fund if those Tier 2s are brought back up. The other things to note here, your retirees are about average age. Your beneficiary, you have one only, a little bit older than what we typically see, and similarly, your disabled, a little bit older than what we typically see. And then the last thing I want to point out is on your terminated vesteds, there are 6 listed here, which sounds like a lot. 4 of them are simply due a refund of the contributions that they have in the fund should they request those. Only 2 of them are actually due an annuity, and the 2 that are due an annuity are the only 2 that are carrying any real significant liability in your fund. Okay, on page 31, it says age and service distribution at the top. Across the top, you see service buckets. Across the leftmost side, you see age buckets. If I focus on that bottom rightmost corner of that page, anybody with more than 20 years of service who's over age 50, there's only one person in that category. So as of the valuation date, only one person was eligible to retire. If I back that off 5 years and I look at anybody over age 45 with more than 15 years of service, I add 3 more. So in total, in the next 5 years, you only have 4 people that are eligible to retire in your fund. That's about 16% of the population. It's very low. So that's a good thing. One, from a workforce planning perspective, you're not having to worry about any significant things there. But in addition, retirements tend to bring higher liability. So to the extent that you're not seeing many coming in your future, means we should be able to keep the liability, under control here and predictable in the next few years so that we have a more predictable contribution pattern. And then the last thing I want to point out is on page 33 of the report, there is a 3-page summary of Article 3 here for you. This shows you the differences between those Tier 1 and Tier 2 benefits. It's, it does not replace Article 3. It's a lot easier to read, though. If you've ever tried to read municipal code, it's not, I'm sure you all have, it's not always the most pleasant. So this is a good starting point if you're curious about what benefits are. So with that, are there any questions?
I know it's a lot. A couple of questions, maybe.
Sure.
Anybody else have a question? Through the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, we're working with our legislators about the things that you're talking about,
Yep.
pushing it out. A lot of, I think that we're one of the more healthier funded. We're at 58% now. Is that what you have? There's a lot of other municipalities that are nowhere near that. And so we're working with our legislature to push that out to 2050 to give a little breathing room for some other municipalities that are struggling with this.
Yep.
So your recommendation, if the legislature just changed that to keep the 2040 is our target.
2040 or even there's other, so what we've seen a lot of funds do is get away from the end date funding entirely because what as I mentioned, what's going to happen is you start approaching 2040, you'll introduce a lot of volatility. Anything that happens, you now have a shorter time frame in which to spread that out over. And so what we've seen a lot of municipalities doing is moving to an open amortization policy. So IMRF actually is phasing down to this right now. So in 2027, IMRF is going to start amortizing their unfunded over a 15-year time frame. And then every valuation, they just re-amortize whatever unfunded exists over the next 15 years. So there's a couple advantages to doing that. One thing right now, if you think about it this way, you're telling the next 18 years of taxpayers that they are responsible for digging you out of the hole of that unfunded. And then the taxpayers after year 18 have no responsibility for that unfunded, just based on the methodology that's defined here. If you use a rolling amortization method, you're always spreading that unfunded out over the next 15 years of taxpayers. And then the next valuation I come to you, I grab one more year of taxpayers. And every year we sort of tack on another year of taxpayers. So it spreads that out over all the future taxpayers, not just the next 18 years. It reduces all that volatility as you start approaching that end date. The disadvantage of it is it does slow the pace at which you get to fully funded. So to the extent that you wanted to achieve full funding, that might not be the best method. It is a method, though, that has some advantages in that sense. It always makes sure you're not going to experience any significant jumps in the contribution because you always have an adequate period in which to spread out any of those gains and losses over. So it's something to consider changing to.
My last question is about the Tier 1, Tier 2. That's reality. I mean, we're working at a meeting about this morning. I mean, this is serious stuff.
Yep.
How is, off the top of your head, if the legislature does go forward with combining them, getting everybody to Tier 2, how is that going to impact us?
So basically, all your Tier 2 benefits are worth about. So if you look at, I'm going to flip you to page 10 of the report. The normal cost tier is listed at 24.3% of payroll. So I would say your Tier 1s are at about 30% of payroll, and your Tier 2s are at about 20%. Okay. So you're looking at about a 10% increase in normal, of payroll in normal cost tier. So that can be quite expensive. And then in addition, all of those benefits that are buried in the accrued liability, what they've already earned, also now jump up.
And we have to back pay that.
Yep, and that'll be part of the unfunded, and it'll add to that amortization payment. That mortgage goes up.
Our state really knows how to treat us well, don't they?
It hasn't
my
passed
gosh.
yet. It hasn't passed yet, but you
I know,
should be
tight-
aware that it's
Well,
there.
it is. I mean, it's real. We're working on this right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's frightening. It's absolutely, going back to what I said about, some municipalities are so much less funded than we are. I mean, that's just going to cause more of a burden on, it's like, yeah, just don't even get me going. That's another hat I wear, and it's absolutely out of control. It's
Yeah.
out of control.
Understood.
Any other questions? Heidi, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Should you come up with any questions later, feel free to reach out to me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next on the topic is facade improvement and interior build-out grant program discussion. Brian, you handling this?
I am. Thank you, Mayor. As the board recalls, back in August, we presented a proposed program. We had some discussion as far as some of the parameters related to a facade grant program. And some of the feedback from the board was looking at not just limiting potential program to the downtown TIF area or the TIF 3 area that was approved that evening, but looking at potential commercial developments outside of that district. And then also looking at, there was a desire for focusing on sales tax producing businesses, but then also identifying that previous businesses that had benefited from the program were non-sales tax as well. So there was a desire to potentially incorporate some of those businesses in the program as well. So this evening, what we have kind of presented before you is the draft program based off that feedback. Essentially, as you can see on the image here, the map highlights kind of the area that's identified as TIF 3 and the commercial properties that are located within that area. So expanding it beyond TIF 3 does not add significantly more commercial properties. Most of the properties that have been developed for commercial are along Cary-Algonquin Road. There's some of the infill developments that you have from the intersection of 14 south towards the village of Algonquin along that roadway. And then the commercial properties along Route 14 on the north side, the Park Plaza shopping center, the Cary Square shopping center on out towards the what I refer to as now as Thornton's West. So from retail perspective, expanding it beyond the TIF, did not significantly increase the number of properties that potentially could be assisted by a program. So staff would recommend in this scenario here that any commercial properties that are zoned B1, B2, B3, or B3R, which are our commercial districts that are sales tax producing businesses, would be potentially eligible for a program. The concern, however, with expanding it beyond the TIF is determining what what funding source there would be for that program. And that's, I guess, from staff's perspective, would be part of our upcoming budget discussion as far as how much the board would want to set aside in the next budget for that purpose, so that if businesses were to be eligible for it outside the TIF area, that we would have the funding to set aside in the budget going forward from that standpoint. Again, the staff is proposing interior, exterior improvements for those types of businesses at a 50-50 matching grant, up to a $10,000 maximum, with a minimum $1,000 improvement from that standpoint. Next slide looks at focusing specifically on the TIF. If there's a desire to provide assistance to businesses that do not provide sales tax revenues to the community, that they're potentially the funding source of the TIF could still assist with that. There may be an increased activity or improvements to their property that the village can still benefit off of through additional increment in the TIF district by having those properties improved. So staff would support or is recommending at this point for properties that are zoned B1 or B3R within that district to be eligible for exterior improvements only, so not interior improvements, but that would allow for, just an example that we had in the last meeting, the State Farm facility that did the improvement in our last grant program. They're not a sales tax producing business, but they did do significant improvements to the facade of that building that would have been eligible for this type of program. So again, a 50-50 matching grant, same parameters, would just limit it to the exterior of the building versus the interior. One question in this area is if you look at the map, it does remove several properties that are within the TIF that are zoned B2 and B3 individually. And that's a question if the board would want the focus specifically on the B1 and B3R district, which are our older buildings in town. And or if the desire is to include any commercial property within that district. The next slide just kind of goes over again kind of some of the items that staff would recommend be eligible for the grant. So specifically improvements that are made to the real estate and not general maintenance type costs. So looking at permanent improvements like facade renovations, building additions. We would recommend a lower match potentially for street-facing landscaping. So if somebody's improving a property that does not have landscaping currently that meets our current code, that there would be the ability for some assistance in that type of project as well to enhance the streetscape portion of a property as well. We did look at the grant versus loan consideration. Obviously, the village has had loan programs in the past for the revolving loan program. It does add a significant amount of administrative time from a management standpoint to receive payments from those individuals. We did research the grant program that we had previously was funded, or the loan program I should say, was funded through a grant from the state of Illinois. That program is not being actively administered today by the state, so we are looking for other ways that potentially that program could be funded as well if we wanted to pursue that again. But this evening we're just primarily wanting to discuss the proposed grant program, if it's something the board is on board with pursuing, and then happy to answer any questions or have additional discussion on it as presented.
Thank you, Brian. Any comments from the board? Or the committee, I should say?
I have how many businesses have asked or inquired about the grant program within the last year?
Well, since we don't have a program
I know
currently,
we don't have one. How many have asked if we did have one?
It's a common question we do receive as far as what type of incentives the village offers. So we have had new businesses come into the community that have looked for assistance, and unfortunately we haven't had anything to provide for them. So I would just say in the last year we've had 2 or 3 businesses that have opened in the community that all have inquired on it. And there are businesses that are looking to expand or renovate their existing space, and it is a question that we do have on occasion from that standpoint. Staff just attended the ICSC show last week, and that was generally a comment that you hear from prospective retailers or developers is, what incentives can you offer me? Without having programs in place, it does put us at a disadvantage from that standpoint of not having some potential offering.
With the funding coming from the TIF 3 and TIF 3 only, is most of those businesses that have asked, or new businesses coming in that area or outside of that area?
It's a mix. So we've had, if there's a business that opened in the Westlake Shopping Center more recently inquired on incentives, and another business was in the downtown area.
Thank you.
What was the point, Brian, of, I can't remember, the reconfiguration of interior spaces? Was that original, or did we add that?
It was original. So this is the same list that we had previously.
Okay.
So if somebody's doing a remodeling of an existing storefront, and they're gutting the storefront to make it work for their needs, that would be an expense that, they're incurring to improve the property that would remain with the property. So those would be improvements that generally we would be encouraging of for the inside of a tenant space. So if it's an example is a restaurant goes into a space that was formerly a retail space, there's significant improvements that are necessary to modify the tenant space to accommodate that. So with it being within the sales tax producing business, the revenue that's coming into us, we're looking for ways that we can potentially assist with those initial startup costs.
Well, number one, I'm definitely in support of coming up with something. I think that it's quite evident just by Brian, by you mentioning, by Director Simmons mentioning how many people have inquired about it when they're coming here, when they're looking to build out. We're competing with other communities around us that have programs like this. I do like the breakdown, though, between what we're going to allow if someone's a sales tax producing business versus not. Meaning we'll let you do your outside, but if you're producing sales business, we're going to let you do some more interior work. So I just think that one of the reasons to me that this is really important to look at, besides just from an economic development standpoint, it's also because we told our residents that one of the reasons we're doing this TIF is to generate business. And to me, we should be able to take these funds and reinvest this and help these businesses that we currently have in our area or ones that want to get here. So to me, it's a little bit of, you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk. So I'm definitely in support of how you've set this up, and obviously maybe tweaking it here and there, but overall, I'm very excited about the opportunity to offer this.
One thing, too, just to add, within the packet, I did include a general breakdown of businesses that do produce sales taxes. That's just provided for reference so you can get an idea of what type of businesses do produce taxes. We're not recommending that there's a specific limit for how much taxes a business may produce, just to have that available if you are producing sales taxes that you would be potentially eligible for the program.
Trustee Walworth, nodding head. Go ahead.
Very, very agreeable. The only, and it's a very moderate question, what would define a permanent outdoor dining improvement versus a temporary outdoor dining improvement?
Good question. So if it's a property that currently does not have an outdoor dining area, if they were to construct a patio, pavement, or define an area that would have permanent fencing or pavement from that standpoint, would be more a permanent location. But tables and chairs and umbrellas would not be something that we would recommend be part of that. That's a furnishing that can be removed with the property or the business if it left the property.
One thing I'd like to see shuffled over is the painting. Make it exterior only. A lot of communities are painting some dilapidating buildings and doing some incredible things with that, because that would stay with the building. Obviously, we're not. I think that we've actually talked to some of our property owners downtown. They were willing to paint their buildings, and some of them are yes, some of them are they'll think about it, some of them are no. But I would like, I understand the painting on the interior of the buildings, but I think if that's something that would definitely change the look and facade of a building, would be more beneficial to the entire community.
Again, it still has to be a match, so it's not as if we're picking up the whole thing. So they've got to invest in as much as we are with regards to doing something like that. So I would definitely be open to doing that. Not the interior, but the exterior for sure, no matter what the situation is.
Any other comments?
Brian, could you go back a couple slides to the one that referenced inside the TIF and the properties that were eligible? I believe you were wanting to verify that the board is okay with the properties that are included in this program within the TIF and the ones that may not be.
Yeah, what's excluded?
Yeah, if you see this slide here, you can see kind of the blow-up portion shows the B1 and the B3R district. So that's essentially the oldest structures that are in the downtown area along Route 14 and Main Street. So from the intersection of Main or East Main and Route 14, adjacent to the CVS, is where the B3R district starts. The properties that are right at the intersection of First Street and 14 are actually zone B3, not B3R. So the existing Coldwell Banker building and the Marathon Station, and then the shopping center to the north of that on First Street are zone B3. So if we limit it to the B1 and B3R, those properties would not be eligible for non-sales tax producing businesses for facade enhancements. If it's a sales tax producing business, they still would be eligible for it.
Which several of them are already, correct?
Several of them are, yeah. So the liquor store, the groceries, all the businesses that are there, yeah. But if you have an office that locates in that shopping center, then essentially that would not be eligible for interior improvements. Exterior improvements still would be eligible for. And then as you travel down Route 14 beyond the downtown area, where there's the kinder care, daycare, and then you have adjacent to that the dentist's office. There's an office building, and then the gas station, and then the Cary Corner Shopping Center where the Eggville restaurant is as well. That is zoned. Those properties are zoned B3 and B2 as well. So any non-sales tax producing business would not be eligible for interior improvements in those properties based on this proposal. So that'd be the kind of the areas that get pulled out. And then also traveling from the CVS further east, all those properties are zoned B2 or B3 as well. So if there's a desire to allow those properties to have non-sales tax producing businesses and still be eligible for the grant, we can add those back in to this as well.
Is there an
fine.
opportunity to do that on a case-by-case basis? The first one that pops into my mind is the old Coldwell Banker building that is up for sale. That this could be an enticement for somebody to purchase that and do some work on it if there's a potential for both interior and exterior remodeling to be partially matched funds. So, in my mind, rather than blanket all B3s, everybody's in, since, as Trustee McAlpine said, it's nice to define sales tax generating versus non. But on a case-by-case basis, allowing this handful of businesses to potentially have access to interior funds as well, I think is a worthwhile item.
Especially if it's changing from a non-sales tax generating to sales tax generating.
Because that Coldwell Banker could
Correct. Could be
frankly turn
anything.
into something that's sales tax, yeah. I like
Yeah.
the case-by-case basis is an interesting concept, too.
And for that property as well, I've had some inquiries on potential conversions of that building, not from existing office to potentially residential or other uses there as well. And if there's a significant improvement to the facade or the property in general, there could be a separate redevelopment agreement for that type of use. So if any property within the village, this would be more assisting small businesses as they're located either existing in spaces or moving into new spaces to help them with their upstart costs. But if a developer were to come in that wanted to change the entire property over, there's going to be just significant improvements to their property from that standpoint. That'll be generate separate increment for the TIF that the village can participate in from a redevelopment agreement.
And keeping in mind that the way the TIF budget is set up, that this program is obviously a smaller component, where the major work, like Director Simmons mentioned, is part of a bigger chunk of that TIF budget.
Did you get the information you're looking for, Director Simmons?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Any other comments for staff on this point? Thank you. With that said, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Any roll call?
All in favor?
Roll call, or
All in favor?
all in favor, oh my God.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? If anybody is opposed to adjourning, I am going to
They
get.
wanna sit here longer?
Evidently, it's been a long week already. Is it Friday yet? Oh, my God.
It's Tuesday.
Thanks, Heidi.